I've always been the responsible one. I don't think anyone ever called me the fun one, but that's okay. Someone had to keep things running smoothly, and if it wasn't me, then who? I'm Sarah, and I've spent my entire adult life taking care of things that others, namely my parents, didn't want to deal with. Bills, car payments, property taxes for the family vacation home. We all had our roles, and mine just happened to be to bail everyone out. You see, I'm the eldest in the family. I was the dependable one who went off to college, worked part-time jobs to pay my own tuition, and later landed a decent job at a financial firm. I'm not rolling in money, but I'm comfortable. I have my own small apartment, a modest savings account, and a quiet life that I built for myself after working hard for years. Then there's Natalie, my younger sister. Natalie was always the golden child, or at least that's how I saw it. She didn't have to work hard for anything. She got the car I never had, the clothes I could never afford, and the trips I had to fund for the family with my own savings. Dad always made sure to buy her the latest iPhone, and Mom would tell me how I was so smart for handling my finances so well. But all of this felt like code for, you're the one who doesn't need help, so we'll give it all to Natalie. Growing up, it was always me who took the brunt of responsibility. I remember being in high school and seeing my sister get the latest gadgets, even as I was helping pay for groceries. I didn't complain at first. It was just the way things were. Mom and Dad never asked for much, so I never thought to say no. But over the years, I'd realized that I was silently covering the costs of everything. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s and starting to look at my own savings and future that the toll it had taken on me became clear. It wasn't a huge deal at first, just a few thousand here and there. Helping out with the bills, covering Natalie's car payments when she got behind, paying the property taxes on the family's vacation house, something I didn't even use as much anymore. But the pressure slowly mounted. The odd requests started becoming more frequent. Every year, I seemed to be the one footing the bill. Then one day, I stumbled across a file on my father's desk. It was a random moment, a slip of paper that caught my eye when I was visiting for dinner. The document was thick, with all kinds of legal language, but what stood out was the title, Trust Fund for Natalie Sullivan. I hadn't meant to snoop, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. For years, my father had been secretly putting money into a trust fund for my sister. A trust fund I had no idea about. I had been the one to pay for everything. Everything from property taxes on the lake house to family holidays, and yet my sister had been getting money put aside for her future, something I never received. I felt sick, betrayed even. But why would they hide it? Why didn't I know? I had always assumed we were a team. Family helps family. That was the unspoken rule. But this was different. This was secretive. This was something planned behind my back, and I had been none the wiser, always the one making sacrifices. The thing is, I had always thought that I was the one who was seen as the responsible one in the family, the one who didn't need help. But this was something different. My parents had built a safety net for Natalie that didn't include me, and I couldn't keep playing this role where I was the family's financial crutch anymore. I wasn't mad at Natalie. She had no idea about the trust fund. She just used what she was given. But I was angry at my parents, especially Dad. I had spent my entire adult life carrying this family's weight while he quietly padded his younger daughter's future. I knew it was time to change things. But how? That night I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the financial documents I had taken from my father's desk. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing. I had always thought I was just doing the right thing, but now I realized how much I had been taken for granted. I had supported my family for so long, and it wasn't even being acknowledged. There was no thank you, no, we appreciate what you've done. It was just expected, but I couldn't keep doing this anymore. I closed the file and made a decision. It was time to stop funding their vacation home, to stop carrying their weight. If they wanted to treat me like an ATM, then I was going to stop letting them. I had worked too hard to build a life of my own, to continue draining myself to support them. The next day I took the first step. I called my bank and canceled the automatic payments for the vacation home taxes. I changed my account settings so that none of the funds I had been allocating to my parents were transferred anymore. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of freedom. I wasn't the family's financial savior anymore. I was just Sarah, and if they wanted my help now, they'd have to ask. The first few days after I stopped making the payments were quiet. At least I thought they would be. But as soon as the first of the month came and the property taxes went unpaid, I got a call. It was from Dad, and I could feel his usual authoritative tone the moment I picked up the phone. "Sarah, the taxes on the vacation home haven't been paid," he said, his voice tight. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath. The words I'd been rehearsing in my head for days finally escaped my lips. "I'm not paying them anymore, Dad." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head, trying to process the statement. "What do you mean you're not paying? You've always taken care of that. What's happened to you?" His voice was laced with disbelief. "I've been paying for years, Dad," I said, trying to keep my calm. "More than $100,000 over the past 5 years. Taxes, vacations, car payments for Natalie. I've supported all of you while you've secretly set up a trust fund for Natalie. But I never got anything like that. I didn't even know it existed." There was a long pause before he spoke again, and when he did, his tone was colder, sharper. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're overreacting. Your sister's trust fund is for her future security. We've always made sure you were fine." "Fine?" I nearly laughed, though it wasn't funny. "I've been working my butt off, putting money aside for you all, making sure the lake house stays intact, and I'm fine? You've been making decisions about me behind my back, Dad. I deserve to know what's going on." "Well, you don't need to act like this," he muttered. "You're being unreasonable." "No, Dad, you're being unreasonable," I shot back. "I'm tired of always being the one who gives, without ever getting anything back. This is where it stops." His silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. "I have my own future to think about now," I added, my voice firm. "And I'm not going to keep carrying this burden for you and Mom." I hung up before he could say another word, though I knew it wouldn't be the last time he'd try to call. That evening I received a text message from Natalie. The words were simple. "We need to talk." My heart sank. I had expected this moment, though it still didn't make it any easier. I sat there for a few moments, staring at my phone, trying to summon the courage to respond. Eventually I typed back, "I'll be over tomorrow evening." When I arrived at my parents' house the next night, Natalie was sitting in the living room, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. She didn't look like the confident, entitled sister I had always known. Instead, she looked like she had been caught in a lie, though I hadn't done anything wrong. It was just the weight of everything that had finally come crashing down on her. "Sarah," she said, her voice a little shaky, "what's going on? Why are you pulling away from us like this?" I sat down across from her, trying to keep my voice steady despite the emotions swirling in my chest. "I've been carrying this family for years, Natalie, and I'm done. I'm not going to be your ATM anymore." She blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about? You've had a trust fund this whole time. Dad and Mom set it up for you without telling me. Meanwhile, I've been paying your car payments, covering the lake house taxes, and funding family trips. You never had to worry about money, but I've been busting my ass to support everyone, and it's never been acknowledged. I didn't even know this trust fund existed until recently." Natalie's face paled. She opened her mouth to say something but stopped herself, as though she couldn't quite find the words. I didn't know. I mean, I knew that Dad helped me out with some things, but I didn't realize you were doing all of that for me. I thought you just had your life together. You've always been the one who was fine." That hit me hard. I had always been the one who took care of everything, and even Natalie had never questioned it. It was as if everyone assumed I didn't need help, that I was just this unshakable force holding it all together. "I was fine, but at what cost, Nat?" I said, my voice quieter now. "I've drained my savings just to keep things running. I've taken loans to make sure you and Mom and Dad were taken care of. And for what? I'm not getting anything out of this. I've had to give up so much, and it's just expected of me." "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice cracking a little. "I swear I didn't know." I could see the guilt in her eyes now, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a tiny bit of relief. She wasn't entirely blind to the situation, even if she hadn't seen the full picture. "Well, now you know," I said softly, "and I can't keep doing this. I'm not your bank, Natalie. I need to think about myself for once." She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I get it. I'm sorry, Sarah. I never meant for this to happen." The conversation felt like a weight had been lifted, but I knew it wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. That night, as I lay in bed, I received a call from my father. I had hoped maybe the conversation would end there, but I knew better. Sarah, you can't just walk away from us like this, he said, his voice thin and strained. You're breaking up the family. I could hear the familiar tone of guilt creeping into his voice, but it no longer had the power to sway me. I'm not breaking up the family, Dad, I replied, my voice steady but firm. I'm just standing up for myself. You and Mom have been treating me like the responsible one, the one who doesn't need anything. I'm not going to do it anymore, not unless things change. I hung up the phone, a sense of finality settling over me. I knew this was the beginning of something big. The family dynamic I had lived with for so long was shifting, and I wasn't sure how it would play out, but I was done pretending everything was okay. I was ready for whatever came next. The days following my conversation with Natalie were far from peaceful. The dynamic at home was no longer the same. Every phone call felt strained, every family gathering awkward. My father had tried to call me twice, but I ignored his calls. My mother had sent a text message telling me she didn't understand why I was doing this and wished I would just talk to Dad. But the last thing I wanted to do was to go back to being the person who kept everything afloat while being taken for granted. The weekend arrived, and with it, a family gathering. I had gotten word from Aunt Elaine, she was always the one who kept me in the loop, that it was going to be held at my parents' house. It was meant to be a casual event, but I knew better. They were gathering everyone to discuss the issues surrounding the lake house, and likely my decision to stop helping. I could feel the pressure building even before I showed up. I'd been avoiding them for weeks now. Part of me wanted to let it go, to leave them to figure it out on their own, but another part of me knew that wasn't an option. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect, or the lack of it. It was about boundaries that had been crossed for far too long. It was about making sure that I wasn't the one left holding the bag, the scapegoat for every financial mess they'd gotten themselves into. Saturday came, and I forced myself to walk into my parents' house with my head held high. As I entered the living room, I was met with the usual awkward silence. My parents, aunt, uncles, and cousins sat around, a few of them glancing up at me nervously, like I was the one who had betrayed them. But I didn't care anymore. I was tired of being the one everyone relied on, and then turned their back on when it suited them. Dad stood up from his seat near the fireplace, his expression unreadable, though I could sense his agitation. Sarah, he said, his voice tight, I'm glad you could join us. We were just discussing the future of the vacation home, and we all thought it would be helpful for you to be part of the conversation. I stood at the doorway for a moment before stepping inside, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no intention of sitting idly by and letting them manipulate me into doing what they wanted. I'm sure you were, I replied coolly, and I'm sure you've been telling everyone what's going on. He didn't respond immediately, but I could see his jaw clench. He hated being called out. I've been reviewing the numbers, I continued, setting my briefcase on the coffee table. I've paid over $118,000 to keep this family's interests afloat. For the last 5 years, I've been the one taking care of things, while the trust fund you set up for Natalie remained untouched. There was a collective murmur from the room as the reality of my words set in. My father's face flushed, and for a brief moment I saw him hesitate. Aunt Elaine, always the loudest, was the first to speak up. What trust fund? Her voice was sharp. I had no idea about this. I thought your father was just helping Natalie out with college and some other things. I turned to face my father, who remained silent, a deep unease in his eyes. It was as though the truth had just cracked the foundation of his carefully constructed lies. I continued, handing out the financial documents I had brought with me. These are the records. I've paid taxes on the lake house. I've funded family vacations, car payments, and more. While my sister got $350,000 placed into a trust fund for her future, and I never saw a penny of it. I didn't even know it existed until recently. The room erupted into chaos. Aunt Elaine raised her voice, her words overlapping with Uncle James's, who was now pacing in the corner. My cousins, who had always thought of me as the successful one, looked at me with a mix of confusion and disbelief. I could feel their eyes on me, but this time, it didn't matter. Megan, my sister, was sitting on the couch, staring down at her hands, too ashamed to look anyone in the eye. She hadn't said a word. What the hell is going on here? Uncle Greg finally shouted, his face reddened. You're telling me we've been left in the dark about this? I stood there, letting the weight of the moment settle. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't going to yell or scream. This was about showing them that I wasn't afraid to stand up for myself anymore. It's not about the money, I said, my voice firm. It's about fairness, about how my contributions were never acknowledged. I've supported this family financially, and none of you even noticed. This isn't just about some vacation house or car payments. This is about respect. You all took it for granted that I'd always be there to pick up the slack. But I'm done with that. My father's eyes locked with mine. For the first time, I saw something other than anger in them. Fear. There was real fear there. Fear that his secret had been exposed, that his control over the family was slipping. And underneath that fear, a hint of something else. Respect. Sarah, he said, his voice quieter now, this is a private matter. We should have handled this better.
Yeah, you should have, I replied, refusing to back down. But you didn't, and now you have to deal with the consequences. Uncle Greg, still standing, let out a long sigh. This isn't the way to handle this, Sarah, but I can't say I don't understand where you're coming from. This is a mess. Yes, it is, I agreed, but it's been a mess for a long time, and no one ever thought to fix it until now. The room went silent, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe I had made a mistake by confronting everyone like this. But then Aunt Elaine spoke again, her tone much softer than before. I never knew any of this, she said quietly. I always thought Sarah was just fine. I never realized the weight she was carrying. Neither did I, Uncle James added, sitting down next to his wife, shaking his head. We've all been blind to this. At that moment, I felt a strange sense of validation. For years, I'd felt like I was invisible, like my sacrifices didn't matter. But now the people who mattered, those who had always turned a blind eye, were finally seeing it, and I wasn't backing down. Maybe it's time for all of you to take a good look at what's been happening in this family, I said, my voice steady. I've been the one who gave while others took. I'm done with that. I'm not going to keep supporting the family in the same way. There was a long silence, and then, for the first time in years, I heard my father speak, his voice rough. You've always been the responsible one, Sarah, he said, his eyes avoiding mine. Maybe it's time we stop relying on you for everything. The air in the room was thick with tension. My father, still standing near the fireplace, his hands clenched into fists, appeared to be struggling with the weight of the truth I had laid out before him. The silence that followed my words felt suffocating, as if the very walls of the house were closing in on us. I could see that the reality of the situation was slowly sinking in. Uncle Greg, still in shock, glanced around the room at the others, but no one seemed to know what to say next. My mother was sitting silently on the couch, her face pale. I could almost hear her internal conflict, the years of protecting my father's decisions versus the dawning realization of how much she had turned a blind eye to. I didn't know it was this much, Megan finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words broke the stillness like a crack of thunder. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of guilt and confusion as she looked up from her hands, which she had been clutching tightly in her lap. I didn't respond immediately. I knew Megan well enough to know that her guilt wasn't just from hearing about the trust fund. It was from the uncomfortable truth that she had benefited from it, all the while unaware of the sacrifices I had made. But that didn't change what had happened. Her sudden realization wasn't enough to undo the damage that had already been done. You didn't know, I said, my voice steady but sharp. You didn't know that I've been the one footing the bill for everything, while Dad set up a trust fund for you? You didn't know how much money I've put into this family over the years? Megan looked at me helplessly, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. No, I didn't, she said, her voice trembling. Dad always said you were fine, that you had your career and your savings. He said you were the independent one, that you didn't need help. Exactly, I replied, my gaze narrowing. I was the independent one, the one who was always expected to pick up the slack because I could. But it wasn't just a little help, Megan. It was $118,000, and you got $350,000 from Dad. Do you understand what that means? She nodded slowly, as if processing the magnitude of the situation for the first time. I could see her struggling with the truth, her internal conflict written all over her face. It was a difficult thing for her to accept, not because she was incapable of understanding, but because it forced her to confront something she hadn't wanted to see. Her father, my parents, had let me carry the burden for so long, and now she was caught in the wake of it all. I didn't know it was that much, Megan repeated almost to herself. I never knew. I just thought you were helping out because you could. And now, her voice trailed off, her guilt consuming her. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence as everyone processed the situation. Aunt Elaine, who had been quiet up until now, stood up and walked over to where I was standing. She placed a hand on my shoulder, her expression softening. Sarah, she said gently, I didn't realize the extent of this either. We all thought you were doing well and that it was your choice to support the family. No one knew about the trust fund or that you had been left out of the equation. I turned to her, the weight of her words not lost on me. It wasn't a choice, Aunt Elaine. It was manipulation. I wasn't asked if I wanted to help. I was expected to. And what's worse is that the whole family, including you, just went along with it. I wasn't asked if I wanted to support the lake house or pay for family vacations, and no one cared enough to question why. Uncle Greg, who had been sitting at the edge of the room, leaned forward and added, I've known for a long time that Greg and your father handled the finances in a way that wasn't fair to everyone, but I never knew the full extent of it. This is a real eye-opener. I turned to face him, my frustration now turning into something else, a sense of resolve. It's not just about the money, Uncle Greg, I said. It's about the fact that no one even cared enough to ask. No one asked me how I was doing or whether I could afford to keep doing this. It was always assumed, and that's the part that hurt the most. Dad, who had been eerily silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke up, his voice uncharacteristically small. Sarah, I never meant for things to go this far. I didn't know how to manage everything, and I thought you'd be okay. I thought you could handle it. I didn't mean to make you feel like you were my personal bank. His words stung more than I expected. They didn't feel like an apology. They felt like an excuse. My father was someone who had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who provided for the family. But now here he was, backpedaling, trying to explain away his actions. I didn't mean for it to be like this, Sarah, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. But you always had a good job, a good career. I thought you'd be fine. I never saw the strain it was causing you. I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt you. I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, relief, disbelief. My father was admitting, for the first time, that he had been wrong. But I couldn't let him off the hook that easily, not after everything. You're sorry, I said, a bitter laugh escaping me. Sorry doesn't fix this, Dad. Sorry doesn't make up for all the years I've been the one sacrificing, the one carrying the burden while you set up a trust fund for Natalie without a second thought. There was a long, heavy pause as my father processed my words. Finally, he sighed and nodded. You're right. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I was blinded by the idea of keeping things easy for you, but I see now that I was wrong. Megan, still sitting on the couch, looked at me with wide eyes. What does this mean, Sarah? She asked softly. Are we done? Is this the end of our relationship? I hesitated before answering. I don't know, Megan.
I'm not sure what this means yet, but what I do know is that things have to change. I'm not going to keep doing this, not without change. The silence in the room after my words felt suffocating. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to process everything that had happened. My father's apology, though long overdue, felt hollow. Megan's guilt was genuine, but I knew it wouldn't undo the years of emotional and financial strain I had endured. And while Uncle Greg, Aunt Elaine, and the others seemed to grasp the injustice of the situation, it was clear that none of them could truly understand the depth of my hurt. My father, still standing near the fireplace, avoided my gaze. His shoulders were hunched, as if the weight of my accusations had physically drained him. He hadn't expected me to confront him so directly, and I could see the unease written all over his face. I didn't want things to go this way, Sarah, my father said again, his voice softer, though still tinged with defensiveness. I only did what I thought was best for the family. I was trying to ensure your future, to make sure you'd never have to worry. By giving everything to Megan and leaving me to foot the bills, I shot back. That's not ensuring my future. That's manipulation. I didn't see it like that, he replied, his voice growing shaky. I thought you were stronger. You always were the responsible one, the one who could handle it all. I didn't think you'd mind helping out. Mind? I repeated bitterly. It wasn't about whether I minded, Dad. It was about being the only one who ever stepped up. While you were setting up trust funds and planning for Megan's future, I was scrambling to cover everything else. I've been paying your way for years. My father's face reddened, and I saw the familiar defensive mask slip away. For a moment, I saw something else in his eyes. Shame. But it was fleeting. He quickly looked away, almost as if ashamed of his own reaction. His hand instinctively reached for the arm of the chair near him, gripping it as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded.
Uncle Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and Anna Lane let out a long, exasperated sigh. "Greg," she said quietly, "I don't think any of us realize just how deep this goes. I knew Sarah was doing a lot for the family, but not to this extent. This is more than just financial support. It's emotional. It's draining. And none of us saw it." "No one saw it," I agreed, my voice trembling with frustration, "because no one bothered to ask. Everyone just assumed I'd be okay, that I didn't need help. And now when I need something, anything, everyone's acting surprised." Anna Lane reached out and placed her hand on mine. "You're right, Sarah. We were blind to it. All of us. I'm sorry, but we can't undo the past. All we can do now is figure out what happens next." I shook my head. "I don't know what comes next. Maybe it's too late to fix anything. But I do know one thing. I'm done being the family ATM. I'm done carrying all of you while you just take." Megan, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, finally spoke up. "What can I do, Sarah?" Her voice was small, unsure. "I want to help, but I don't know how. I didn't know it was like this. I didn't know how much you were sacrificing for us." I stood there for a moment, considering her words. I had spent so many years keeping my frustrations bottled up that now, even when the truth was finally coming to light, I didn't know how to respond. I didn't want to lash out at her. Megan wasn't entirely to blame, but she wasn't innocent either. She had benefited from the trust fund without question, just as I had been expected to cover everything without complaint. "I don't know, Megan," I said finally, my voice softening. "It's not just about money. It's about respect, and about the fact that no one has ever seen me as anything but a resource. I've always been the one who just does. But now I need something different. I need things to be equal. I need to be seen." Megan nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "I see that now. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I should have questioned everything. I should have known. I don't expect you to fix everything," I added, taking a deep breath. "But maybe we can start by acknowledging the damage that's been done, by talking about it, even if it's uncomfortable. We can't keep pretending like everything is fine when it's not." There was another pause, thick with uncertainty. My father, who had been standing in the corner, walked slowly toward me. His steps were heavy, as if he carried the weight of his own failures. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "I don't know if I can, but I want to try. I don't want to lose you, Sarah." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. It wasn't an apology in the traditional sense, but it was the closest thing he could offer. I didn't know if it was enough, but it was a start. "I'm not going anywhere," I said quietly, meeting his gaze. "But we have a long way to go." 3 days later, the aftermath of the family meeting was still fresh. Things had shifted, but there was no quick fix for the emotional scars we had all carried for so long. My father and I hadn't spoken much since that day. He sent me the occasional text, apologizing for his part in the mess, but it didn't feel real. It felt like he was trying to patch things up with a Band-Aid instead of addressing the deeper issues. Megan, on the other hand, had been trying to make amends in her own way. She'd called me a few times, each time sounding more remorseful. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to forgive her fully. Not yet. She hadn't had to carry the same weight I had, and I needed time to process everything. It wasn't just about the money. It never had been. It was about recognition, about respect, about equality. My family had used me as a financial crutch for years, and now they were trying to convince me that they understood. But words were just that. Words. Actions, real actions, would speak louder than any apology ever could. As I sat at my desk later that evening, sorting through some new financial plans, a message pinged on my phone. It was from Megan. "Sarah, I've spoken to Dad. I convinced him to divide the trust fund equally. I'm sorry for everything. I know it doesn't fix what's been done, but I hope it's a step in the right direction." I read the message several times before responding. "Thank you, Megan. It's a start, but we still have a long road ahead." The days that followed the family meeting were a blur.
My father's attempts to apologize were sporadic, and I could feel the tension in the air each time we exchanged a word. Every conversation felt like walking on eggshells, as if he were waiting for me to suddenly lash out. It was clear he was struggling, but that didn't mean I was ready to make peace just yet. Not when I still carried the weight of everything I had given, everything that had been taken from me. Megan's calls became more frequent. Each time she sounded increasingly remorseful, but her tone had shifted from sorrowful to almost desperate. It was as though she wanted to mend things quickly, to fix the cracks in our relationship that had been left unaddressed for so long. But I wasn't sure I was ready to forgive her completely. I had always thought that Megan and I were close. At least I had convinced myself of it. But now, with the veil lifted, I could see how our relationship had been skewed by the imbalance of attention and resources in our family. She had never questioned the favoritism. She had never stopped to wonder why it was always me who paid the price. And I couldn't just move on from that. Despite everything, I wasn't ready to completely cut ties. We were family after all. But the dynamics had shifted, and it would take time to rebuild that trust, if it could even be rebuilt. 2 weeks later, it was a Saturday morning when my phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen to see Megan's name flashing across it, but this time, there was an unfamiliar sense of resolve in her message. "Sarah, can we meet up today? I need to talk to you about something important." I hesitated for a moment before responding. The past few weeks had been an emotional roller coaster, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for another heavy conversation with her. But there was something in her message, something that made me feel like this conversation would be different. "Sure, let me know when and where." Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting at a small cafe in the city, waiting for Megan to arrive. The weather was crisp and cool, but the chill didn't bother me as much as it normally would. There was an unfamiliar sense of quiet determination within me. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life. Megan arrived a few minutes later, looking a little out of place in the busy cafe. She wore a soft, casual sweater and jeans, her hair loosely pulled back in a messy bun. But it was her eyes that drew me in. Her eyes were different. They no longer held the same innocent curiosity that they once did. There was something heavier in them now, something older, wiser. She sat down across from me, her hands trembling slightly as she placed her coffee cup on the table. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said softly, her voice hesitant. "Of course," I replied, folding my arms across my chest. "You said you wanted to talk. What's going on?" Megan took a deep breath, her eyes darting nervously around the cafe. "I've been thinking about everything a lot, and I realized something that I'm ashamed of. I've been blind. I've been so focused on what I was getting that I didn't see what you were sacrificing." I didn't respond immediately, waiting for her to continue, but I could feel a wave of emotion rising inside me. This was the moment where everything could either fall apart or begin to heal. "I never questioned the trust fund," Megan continued. "And I never realized how much you were giving up to help us. I've been selfish, Sarah. I've been so selfish. I don't know how I could have been so blind." Her voice faltered, and I watched as her eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly, as if embarrassed by her own vulnerability. But there was no anger in me anymore. I wasn't angry at her. I was sad, deeply sad, that it had taken this long for her to see it, for her to truly understand what had been happening all these years. "I'm sorry," she whispered, looking up at me with a mixture of guilt and remorse. "I know this doesn't make up for it, but I want to do something to make things right." I raised an eyebrow, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What could you possibly do?" Megan took another breath before responding. "I've asked Dad to divide the trust fund equally between us." I blinked, stunned into silence. I hadn't expected this. Sure, we had talked about the trust fund and the way it had been set up for years, but hearing her say it out loud, it felt surreal. "You did?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of disbelief. "Yes," she nodded. "I want to fix this, Sarah. I want to make sure you get what you deserve. And if Dad's not willing to do it on his own, then I'm going to fight for it. I'll get Uncle Greg and Aunt Elaine involved. They'll back me up. We need to set things right." I stared at her for a moment, trying to process everything. Megan's voice was resolute, her tone firmer than I'd ever heard it before. This wasn't the same person who had once accepted everything without question. This was someone who was finally seeing the truth. And more importantly, someone who wanted to make it right. "I don't know what to say," I said finally, feeling a mix of emotions. It's hard to believe after everything. But thank you. Thank you for doing this. Megan smiled faintly, her eyes still brimming with tears. I know it won't fix everything, but it's a start, right? I nodded. Yeah, it's a start. A week later, the news of Megan's decision spread quickly through the family. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when Uncle Greg and Aunt Elaine contacted me, I felt a glimmer of hope. They both expressed their support for Megan's decision and offered their help in any way they could. It seemed as if the family was finally waking up to the fact that things hadn't been fair, that my years of financial sacrifice hadn't gone unnoticed. The most surprising part, though, was my father's reaction. At first, he resisted. He was angry that Megan had gone behind his back to ask for the division of the trust fund. But as the days passed, I could see a shift in him, a gradual realization that Megan was right and that his actions had caused irreparable damage to his relationship with me. One afternoon, he called me. Sarah, he began, his voice surprisingly calm. I've thought about everything you said. I've been thinking a lot about what's fair, what's right, and I want to make it right. My heart skipped a beat. For the first time in years, I heard sincerity in his voice. He wasn't just trying to appease me or make excuses. He was admitting his mistakes. I'm going to agree to Megan's request, he continued. I'll divide the trust fund between you two. I've been unfair and it's time I fix that. I didn't know how to respond. I was overwhelmed, not with relief, but with something deeper, a sense of justice, of long-awaited fairness. Thank you, Dad, I said quietly. It means a lot, more than you know. 2 weeks later, the legal papers arrived in my inbox just after breakfast. I stared at the email subject line for a moment, my fingers hovering over the screen. It was hard to believe that the time had come for my father to actually honor his word, to finally split the trust fund between Megan and me. I opened the email, the legal jargon swimming in front of my eyes. But the key detail was clear. The assets of the trust fund had been divided equally between Megan and me, and the lake house was now officially titled in joint ownership. It was a small victory, but it meant a lot. There was no going back. The damage had been done, but at least now there was recognition of my sacrifices, of my contributions. Megan sent me a text later that morning. I just saw the papers. It's done. I can't believe it, but I'm glad it's finally over. I hope we can move forward from here. I stared at her message for a long time, processing what it meant. We had finally reached an agreement, but the path forward wasn't clear. My relationship with my father was still strained, and I wasn't sure if it could ever go back to what it was before all this started. Still, I couldn't deny the sense of relief that came with knowing I had stood up for myself, and that, for once, my voice had been heard. A month later, the family gathering was coming up. This time, I was dreading it in a way I hadn't before. It wasn't just the pressure of being surrounded by people who had, in varying degrees, failed to see the full picture. It was the knowledge that I'd done something I never thought I'd be able to do. I'd set boundaries, drawn a line, and made it clear that I wouldn't be taken advantage of anymore. But the quiet weight of that choice was settling in. The family dynamics had changed, and I had no idea how people would react to the news of the split. Would they see me as the villain? Would they view me as someone who tore the family apart for her own gain? Or would they finally understand why I'd made the decisions I did? I didn't know, and it wasn't something I could control anymore. On the day of the gathering, I dressed in a simple black dress and blazer, wanting to maintain a level of professionalism in an environment that, up until now, had been emotionally fraught. My phone buzzed once more as I arrived at my parents' house. It was a text from Megan. I'm really nervous about this. I want everything to be okay. But no matter what, I'm proud of you for doing what you did. Don't let them push you around. We'll face it together, okay? I smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over me. This was a new side of Megan I hadn't seen before. Strong, aware, and willing to stand up for what was right. It was comforting to know that, despite everything, she was on my side. The gathering. As I entered the living room, the familiar sight of the family set the stage for what would be an emotional reckoning. There was the usual chatter, the hum of voices as relatives greeted one another, but beneath it all, I could sense a shift, a tension in the air that wasn't there before. Megan was already there, standing near the fireplace, her arms crossed as she talked to Aunt Catherine. As I walked into the room, the conversations tapered off, eyes darting in my direction. My father sat on the couch, his face unreadable, while my mother looked as though she had been crying, her eyes red and swollen. It was clear that things weren't normal. The confrontation was inevitable. I took a seat next to Megan, who gave me a small, reassuring smile. My father's gaze met mine briefly, then quickly shifted away. He seemed unsure of how to act. For a moment, I wondered if he was regretting the changes he'd made, but I quickly dismissed the thought. He had made his bed. Now it was time for him to lie in it. Aunt Elaine, who had always been an ally, came up to me first. "I just want to say, Sarah, that I'm so proud of you," she said quietly, pulling me aside. "What you did was hard, but it was necessary. This family needed a wake-up call." I didn't know what to say to that. It felt good to hear, but it also reminded me that it shouldn't have had to come to this. We shouldn't have needed a wake-up call. The inequity should have been clear to everyone long before I had to step in. My father cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the room. "I suppose we all need to have a conversation about the changes in the family," he began, his voice shaky. But at least there was an effort to acknowledge what had happened. It was then that I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about power, control, and family dynamics. It was about the things that had been left unspoken for so long, the things that had been ignored, overlooked, and buried. "Let's get everything out in the open," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I've never been comfortable with the way things have been. I've always felt like I was expected to keep giving, without ever being asked if I was okay. And I wasn't okay. But I'm done being the one to pick up the slack. I won't allow that anymore." My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Megan's eyes locked onto mine, full of understanding. This was the first time in years that I felt like I wasn't standing alone in this battle. "We've all had a part to play in this," Aunt Elaine added. "And it's time we all take responsibility. It's not just about money. It's about how we treat each other." There was a moment of silence as everyone processed her words. Then Uncle Greg, who had always been outspoken, stood up. "I agree with Elaine. We've all let things slide for too long, and Sarah's right. We all have a part in what's happened, but it's time to move forward, together." I nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for this family to heal. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a start. 1 month later, the road to rebuilding my relationship with my family hadn't been easy. There were still awkward moments, uncomfortable silences, and a lot of old wounds that hadn't fully healed. But there was progress. There was a sense of mutual respect that hadn't been there before, and even though the past couldn't be erased, we were trying to move forward. My father had made more efforts to include me in financial discussions, something that felt like a small victory in itself. We still had a long way to go, but the gap had narrowed. Megan and I had grown closer as well, not just because of the trust fund situation, but because we had finally started to communicate openly about our feelings. I'd realized something in the process. Standing up for myself, asserting my needs, and demanding fairness hadn't just healed my relationship with my family. It had healed me. And I was finally starting to feel like I could let go of the resentment. I had taken control of my life in ways I hadn't thought possible. And while things weren't perfect, they were far better than they had ever been. In the end, it wasn't just about the money. It was about the respect, the recognition, and the acknowledgement that I had the right to stand up for myself. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all. 2 months later. The last few months had been a whirlwind of revelations, confrontations, and surprising growth. Things between my father and me were still delicate, but they were better than they had been before. We spoke more openly now, though the conversation was often still strained, as if neither of us could entirely let go of the old patterns. But at least now, there was a sense of understanding, or, at the very least, a grudging respect. Megan and I were on much better terms, too. It felt as if we had crossed an invisible line in our relationship. We no longer avoided difficult conversations or let the underlying resentments fester. She still had moments of defensiveness, but she no longer dismissed my feelings as she had before. There was a new sense of camaraderie between us, a sense that we were finally on the same team, if not entirely in sync, then at least aware of what the other was going through. Still, there was a sense of caution in the air. Everyone was walking on eggshells, and I couldn't tell if it was a temporary thing or if it would always be like this now. The damage had been done after all, and while things were improving, I was careful not to place too much hope on everything returning to how it once was. People could change, but old habits didn't die easily. The next big event on the horizon was another family meeting. It felt like the last of these gatherings would be the real test. Would we all be able to put the past behind us, or would it all unravel once again? Megan had called me a week earlier to let me know the details. Dad wants to talk about the lake house, she told me, sounding hesitant. He said he's willing to make things right. He wants us to figure out what to do with it. I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. She wanted things to be better, but she wasn't sure if Dad's sudden willingness to make things right was sincere or just a last-ditch effort to save face. I don't know what to think, I admitted, my fingers absently toying with the hem of my sleeve. Part of me wonders if he really gets it now, or if he's just trying to fix things to keep up appearances. I think we'll find out, Megan said, but we should go. It's important, I think, for all of us to show up, for the family, and for ourselves. It was clear that Megan wanted to believe in her father's change. She wanted the family to heal, to be whole again. But I knew that even with the trust fund split, even with the ownership changes, the emotional wounds were deeper than any legal document could heal. Still, we agreed to attend. There was no point in running from it. It would be another hard conversation, another test, but it felt like it was time to face the music and see if anything had truly changed. When I arrived at the house, the atmosphere felt different. There was no grand speech or overblown apology, but there was something else, a shift in the air. It was like everyone knew this was the moment, the final reckoning, the chance to make everything right, or at least to try. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together. Megan and I entered the room together, and I could feel my heart thudding loudly in my chest. It wasn't out of fear, but out of the weight of everything we had already been through. This wasn't just another family meeting. This was about seeing if we could all, for once, be honest and real with one another. Megan sat down beside him, and I chose to stand for a moment, unsure whether I wanted to engage or remain distant. I know things have been difficult, my father started, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. And I know I've made mistakes. The admission felt strange coming from him, but it also felt long overdue. I met his gaze, watching closely for any signs of insincerity, but found none. There was no bravado this time, no defensiveness, just raw honesty. I should have treated you both equally, he continued. I didn't. I let my own fears cloud my judgment. I made choices that hurt you, and I can't take them back. Megan nodded, her eyes glistening. She was taking it all in, carefully processing his words. I could see how much it meant to her, how much she wanted to believe that he could change. I know there's no way to make up for everything, he said, pausing. But I want to try. I'm sorry for not being the father you needed me to be. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable, but necessary. I could feel the weight of the years spent under the surface of our family dynamics. The resentment, the unspoken truths, the feeling that we had all been playing a game with different rules. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the years of emotional neglect and misplaced priorities. I'm glad you said that, I said, my voice calm but firm. But words alone aren't enough. I've spent too many years feeling overlooked, like my sacrifices meant nothing. I did what I thought was right, but it shouldn't have been my responsibility alone. He nodded, as if understanding that my words weren't just an accusation. They were a plea for change. Megan cleared her throat. Maybe it's not about just fixing everything, she said. Maybe it's about showing that we can move forward, together. I looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. She had grown so much in the last few months. She understood now in a way she hadn't before. She was beginning to see the bigger picture. We all need to make some changes, I added. And that includes me. I won't just be the one who fixes everything anymore. If we're going to move forward, it has to be equal. We all have to carry our weight. There was a long pause as my father absorbed my words. The truth hung in the air, no longer being hidden behind pretense or secrecy. I agree, he said finally, and I'll do my best to make sure things are different. The meeting didn't end with a grand resolution, but there was a shared understanding. There was a subtle change in the way my father looked at me, as if he had finally realized that I wasn't just his backup plan, his safety net. I wasn't just the one who should be expected to take care of everything. And Megan was no longer the princess of the family, the one who could always rely on everyone else to solve her problems. It wasn't about the trust fund anymore. It was about learning to stand on our own feet and treat each other with respect. We agreed to continue with the family holidays, but now they wouldn't just be about the lake house. They'd be about the relationships we had and the ones we were still trying to build. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the right path.